Good morning. Welcome to day 5 of our journey through Job. Today we're going to start right off talking about the fourth character that we're introduced here in the book of Job, and that is Bildad. Bildad is one of Job's friends. We've met Eliphaz, we met Job himself, and of course we met his accuser, Satan, early on in Job. And today we're covering chapters 8 through 10. 8 through 10 if you're reading along. And just like Eliphaz, Bildad assumes that all suffering is a result and a punishment of sin. And the text implies here that Job believed the same, because if he did not believe the same, he wouldn't have been entering into the argument with his friends. He wouldn't have engaged in the argument with his friends. I don't know if you've had that experience where someone maybe said something and you quickly dismissed it. It didn't even enter your thoughts. It wasn't an invitation to consider or doubt or pause. However, because Bildad and Eliphaz and even Job's wife were close to him, they were trusted. He loved them and he believed that they loved him, and they did. He then paused and engaged in these conversations with them. And that's what's so hard about these arguments and these debates, in that we wouldn't have entered into them to begin with if there hadn't already been some relationship with these people. And because there was relationship with these people, it makes it so much more difficult for Job himself, but also for his friends and his wife, right? If we're witnessing pain in someone and we want to salvage, save them, help them, get them out of the way of pain, then we're going to get passionate about our arguments and our reasonings and our discussions with them, because we're trying desperately to save them from what they're experiencing. And yet, because our friends here didn't pause to consider, here's the knowledge I have, but here's what my heart is saying to me, we find that they get deeper and deeper. And so here we enter into chapter 8, and we know that this is the assumption that they're making. They're saying suffering is a consequence of sin, and if suffering is even sometimes a punishment of sin, then your suffering must be a result of your sin. But what we know is not all suffering is a result of sin. Why? Because we knew Job was blameless to begin with, and we know now in hindsight that that's not true according to God's word. So his verdict and argument becomes compassionless. He completely moves from this concern for his friend, and in the arguments, these arguments start to escalate, and that's what we'll see. It starts with Eliphaz saying, hey, maybe you need to consider some things, Job. Do you need to repent from something? And then Bildad's argument escalates, and we'll see tomorrow that Zophar really takes it to another level. And so here's what Bildad says. It says in chapter 8, verse 4, he said, since your children have sinned against God, he gave them over to their rebellion. And that is so heartless. Basically, he's saying your children must have sinned against God, so they deserved the punishment they received. And if you remember correctly, his kids died in a house collapse. So he's like, they got what they deserved. They must have been doing something wrong. And that is just so cruel. Think of this. This is your friend. Could you imagine if something happened to your child and your friend came over and said, well, they deserved it because they must have done something wrong. And so now it's getting really personal, but also you can see how this argument is escalating, because they're finding that maybe what we've been standing on all this time doesn't really hold ground here and in this circumstance. So Bildad was defining justice according to his own standards, his understanding of accumulated human tradition. In verse 8, he says, for ask the previous generations and pay attention to what their fathers discovered. So here he's looking at, okay, here's everything we've learned, and here's what we believed, and I'm not willing to let go of that. I'm not willing to let go of that foundation. But it's so scary for our friends here, including Job. If I let go of this foundation that I built my belief and my world around, then what does that mean? Where can I go? What do I have to do? And what does the world look like now, right? It's big work to turn over the soil of what you've been standing on, what you've built your life and your beliefs and your morals and your high ground on, right? Why? High ground means that I feel safer here because I've established this. And if I don't have these beliefs and values, now I'm in this vulnerable place in that I have to open up my heart and my mind and maybe consider that things aren't as I thought they were. And that can be a scary place when we are looking to each other or looking to ourselves. There is a quote by one of the the devotions that I was reading, and it was a woman. She said, "We cannot be our own standard of justice because we are definite, fallen, and quick to condemn." Why are we quick to condemn? Because that's how our brains operate. It's looking for the fault. It's looking for the trouble. It's looking for the place to avoid. And so it's quick to find and suggest, hey, maybe this is what went wrong here, so let's avoid that. Why? Because our brain is made to help us to survive, to help us bypass pain, to help us bypass suffering, but it doesn't always make the right assumptions. So Job acknowledges in chapter 9 that, God is wise. He's not debating with his friends about that. He's saying, God's wisdom and power, like I acknowledge all of that. But then he starts to question his line of reasoning when it comes to this justice. Why? Because he's going through this. So he's like, I know what I did and didn't do. I know that I pursued God and I followed his commandments. But if that's true, and if I also believe that suffering was a punishment of sin, then something is off. Something is different. But he goes into this thought process in chapter 9, and he's like, well, if I'm innocent and my friends are just coming at me and they're accusing me of this stuff, he's like, well, then God must destroy both the blameless and the wicked. So they're still holding on to this thesis that they have, including Job, except he knows that there's this battle now inside of him. Wait a second, I believe these things too. I would have argued right with you. If this was Zophar sitting on the floor and had lost everything, I would have had the same argument. But now I'm going through this right now. So I have to reconsider, who is God and what is it that he does? And he says, then he must destroy the blameless and the wicked. If it isn't he, who is it? And this is the first part of the story where he's like, hold up. What is it that I believe? What is it that I stand on? Because something is amiss here. Our prolonged suffering will cause us to question things, right? That's where we move from knowledge into wisdom. We question the things that we maybe believed or the assumptions that we made. And we look at, what does God really say? Who is he really? Who am I really? And I need to consider. So his mind is reeling here in chapter 9. Job's mind is just going with questions and doubts. And later in chapter 42, he admits that all of the stresses of his circumstance were confusing his thinking, that he entered into arguments and debates and questions that just took him on this whirlwind, that he was lost in that. But I love this next part because in verse 28 of chapter 9, he goes, I would still live in terror of all my pains, but I know you will not acquit me. So he turns from the debate. He's going back and forth with his friends, and he turns from the debate and he starts speaking directly to God himself. And how many times have we been in this debate about, no, this is what's right. No, this is what's right. This is what I believe. No, this is what I've learned. And we can go back and forth with our friends and within ourselves when really what we need to do is quiet it all down and turn to God himself and say, God, this is what I'm struggling with. This is what I believed about you. This is what I need to know better about you, God, because right now I am struggling. And so God, I just bring it right before you. And God, show me in my hurt, show me in my pain who you are, because right now I am struggling with that. And I don't know about you, but I've definitely been in that place where I had to go to God directly and say, show me, God, I need to know you better. When human reason fails us, we can go directly to God for clarity, wisdom, and understanding. And when he does that, he first says these words, which are going to be where he ends up, right? We see the hint of where he's headed when he does turn to God directly. He says, I know you. And up until this point, Job knew about God and he thought he knew him. He thought he knew his nature and his character. But we see in the beginning when he said, I was afraid these things were going to happen. We understand that he had this doubt in him that God needed to flush out. He was taking this opportunity of his pain to flush out what was going on inside of him because he knew that he wanted Job to have a relationship with him that he could stand on, that he could testify and witness about. He knew that Job did love him, but he didn't know him well enough yet to be that sounding board, to give God the glory fully and to have an impact on this world. God knew that there were arguments and things that people believed about him that weren't true. And he knows today that there are things and arguments that people have about him today that aren't true. But the question is, have you turned to God? Have you turned to God to ask him those hard questions so that he can answer them for you, so that you could bring the glory of God to your world, to your life, to your families, to your communities, to everyone that you engage with? This year has been one of difficulty and of arguments and reasonings that have hurt each other. And it's time for us to turn to God and engage with God and ask him the questions that we've been afraid to ask, or the questions that we've been asking other people who don't have the answers, that we don't have the answers all the time. He says the words, I know you. And in chapter 10, Job goes through this internal debate that I like to call On the Other Hand. And if you're familiar with Fiddler on the Roof, you know of Tevye. Fiddler on the Roof is a play or a musical about a Jewish man who goes into this debate when his daughters start to present to him like these ideas that aren't following tradition. And he debates whether or not, tradition or understanding or heart versus mind. And he goes into these external debates for the audience to hear. And he goes, is it this or that, right? So on the other hand, I know this, but on the other hand, this is what my heart is saying. And that is the question that we have for us. And that's the question that Job goes through. He goes through questions and doubts and goes on the other hand, and he lists his doubts and he lists his questions, and he begins to weigh out against God's care, against his providence and against his sovereignty. And he acknowledges that Bildad's logic wasn't adding up, and therefore his logic was no longer adding up. And in chapter 10, verse 12, he says, you gave me life and faithful love, and your care has guarded my life. And he starts ending there. If I believed that you were going to harm me, but if you give me life and faithful love and your care has guarded my life, I have to weigh these things because something isn't weighing out. Something isn't adding up. Something has to be corrected and moved. So your reflection for today is this: what area in your thoughts have been lost in your doubts and your questions that you need to start speaking directly to God about that so that you can know him better?